Hi everyone, welcome to Julie Reads Her Bookshelf. I'm Julie. Today I come to you with my January wrap-up, which is a little bit belated, but it should be a pretty short one because in January I only read 2 books. Now, one of those books happens to be Middlemarch by George Eliot, so I don't feel too bad about only reading 2. After all, this is quite a chunker and a pretty challenging read at times. I had an interesting relationship with this book where the first 100 pages, I was really not sure. There was something about kind of the writing and cadence of George Eliot that took a little bit of getting used to. But actually, once I got used to it, I seemed to really turn a corner with this book and I ended up really, really loving it. And once I've finished the book and gave it a little bit of time to settle down in my mind and to stew in the back of my mind, I actually ended up really loving it, and I think it's going to be one of my best reads for the year, which should surprise no one who's actually read Middlemarch. I don't want to give too much of an explanation of the plot of Middlemarch because in some ways this book defies summary, and every plot or blurb summary that I read for Middlemarch has made the book sound really unexciting. And you don't have to worry about that because the book is a plot-driven book in the sense that you will be caught up in the lives of each of these characters. A more accurate description of the book might be that it's a woven tapestry of an English town in the mid-1800s where each character within the book is a strand that's interconnected and woven with others to form kind of this whole. And what George Eliot does really well is showing the interconnectedness between each of these characters and their private motivations. And she does it in a way that is without judgment and so kind. So some of the main characters in the book are Dr. Lydgate and Dorothea Brooke. So Dorothea is an orphan from a wealthy background in town. She ends up marrying an older cleric called Mr. Castlebourne. And she sort of marries him quite suddenly, thinking that she would get meaning in her life by marrying him and devoting her life to his religious studies and his works. But then she becomes disappointed when she realizes that actually he's not the great scholar that he makes him out to be, and that their marriage lacks the kind of vitality that a younger woman like her needed. And at the same time, Dr. Lydgate marries Rosamond Vincy, who's sort of the beauty of the town and from a merchant background, so quite a middle class type marriage. And the two of them then set off on an increasingly disastrous marriage where Rosamond doesn't love him, but she also doesn't understand what it takes for him to realize his ambitions as a doctor. So you've got these two strands of characters who are facing kind of different difficulties within their marriage. And then there's a number of secondary characters, my favorite being Mary Garth and Fred Vincy, who are the cutest couple. So Fred's Rosamond Vincy's brother, and he's sort of he was educated to be a gentleman, but he sort of doesn't really have a direction in life. Other than the fact that he was just hopelessly in love with Mary Garth, who, while she sort of returns his affections in a way, she also really stands her ground and is just an absolutely awesome character and knows who she is and is quite a modern, not at all what I imagine to be a female character in a Victorian novel. So all of these characters' lives eventually sort of come together and you see the relationships between all of them and how it affects their decision making. And what I found most remarkable about this book was just the sheer compassion with which George Eliot viewed each of these characters, even the less savory ones, like someone like Mr. Castlebourne, who really wasn't a very endearing character. George Eliot writes about him with just this sense of non-judgment and compassion and trying to make you see how he came to be the person that he is. and how there's an element of blamelessness in him in terms of marrying Dorothea, who was a much younger woman. And the book sort of winds up in the end to quite what I found to be quite a satisfying ending. And without giving anything away, I think this is one of the more humane and humanist books that I've read in recent years, and I absolutely loved it. I highly recommend, even though it was quite a commitment to read through it, especially the first 100 pages when I really wasn't feeling the book or the writing, but eventually I really did come around and I thought this was absolutely fabulous. So this is a really highly rated recommend from me. The only other book I read in January is Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe. So this was quite a famous book in Australia a couple of years ago. I'm very glad I finally got around to reading it, especially because in Australia towards the second half of this year we will be having a referendum on recognition of Indigenous people in our constitution. So it's really important, I think, for us in Australia to try and find out a bit more about Indigenous culture, Indigenous history, and to think critically about how we ended up in a situation where white Australia or colonial Australia has such a fraught relationship with the First Nations people of this country. Dark Emu at its core is about challenging the commonly held belief that prior to European settlement, Aboriginal people in Australia were hunter-gatherers and nomadic people who did not engage in agriculture. So when I was growing up, one of the things that I learnt through my education was that the colonizers, when they first arrived in Australia, did not recognize Aboriginal people's claim to land because they didn't cultivate the land. And they didn't cultivate the land in a way that the European powers recognized. And that was seen as a justification for Australia being classified as terra nullius, or land belonging to no one, and really the wide-scale theft of Aboriginal land from the First Nations people of this country. That justification falls flat when you read Dark Emu. What Bruce Pascoe does in this book is that he goes through a lot of the journals of early settlers in this country. He goes through their diary entries and critically examines their observations of the First Nations people at the time of European settlement. And what we found throughout this book was quite open observations of Indigenous people cultivating land, managing land, manipulating land in a way that is consistent with agriculture. And same things with building reservoirs and building shelters. It's not the case that Indigenous people didn't have architecture or didn't have any kind of construction and didn't manipulate rivers and water dams in a way that is artificial and man-made. It's that when they did that, it wasn't recognized as such by the European settlers, who had their own agenda for not seeing the obvious and not seeing what's right before their eyes. Because in dismissing the idea that Indigenous people were engaged in agriculture, it justified the eventual European theft of land belonging to those peoples. So when this book came out, it became quite a controversial book in Australia because it's quite a big departure from what had been taught in Australian schools and what was the commonly held belief in Australia at the time. And there was a lot of controversy, particularly by traditional media. So we're really talking about the Murdoch press in Australia, where they went on quite a strong attack of this particular author. I followed it a little bit. I didn't really understand the heat behind this kind of discrediting of Bruce Pascoe, because as far as I can understand, based on all the media coverage, they come from two places. First is that Bruce Pascoe claimed Indigenous heritage, where potentially his claim was a little bit doubtful. Now, I personally don't think that impacts on the book itself. It may impact on Bruce Pascoe's ability to really claim himself to be a representative of certain nations and certain communities, but I don't think it impacts on the substance of the book. I don't care who writes the book. What I care about is the level of scholarship and research that's gone into the book. The second criticism that I've seen of this book is that it tends to exaggerate some of the sources a little bit. So the idea is that potentially some of the observations made by these early European settlers in Australia were taken out of context by Bruce Pascoe to try and prove that there was Aboriginal agriculture to quite a sophisticated level when perhaps that did not exist. I think that may be a fair criticism. My problem with it is that isolated incidents don't detract from the overall systematic research of the book. And what I find interesting about all of these criticisms is that they don't really get us anywhere. To say that Aboriginal people didn't engage in agriculture is a little bit far-fetched by the time you go through all of the evidence, both photographic and also kind of based on contemporaneous diary entries of the early settlers. I think it's fairly conclusive that there was a level of agriculture in Australia by the First Nations people here, and there may be a debate over the level of sophistication within those practices. I don't find it at all extraordinary that the First Nations people of this country, who survived in what would have been quite an inhospitable environment for 40,000 years, I don't find it extraordinary at all that they engaged in some kind of land management or agriculture. In fact, I think we should assume that they did. But rather, I found it extraordinary that we didn't think to look further into it, and that it took until only a few years ago that this book was written, which fundamentally dispelled any notion that Australia was not under the sovereignty of sophisticated cultures and very strong, thriving communities at the time of European settlement. I think it's a really important book. I do really recommend it. It's quite short, so you'll get through it in a couple of days. But I really recommend just finding out more about Indigenous history and Indigenous culture before we go to referendum later on in the year, particularly for those in Australia. So those are the two books that I read. We've got Middlemarch and we've got Dark Emu. That brings my total for unread books down to 86 for the month of January. And in February, I'm actually reading some shorter books to try and knock out a few easy wins along the way. So we'll see what the tally is by the end of February. Thanks, BookTube.